Hi, welcome back to our channel. Today we are looking at chapter 12 of the book The Ending of Time, and it's actually the second to last chapter, so I'm gonna have to start thinking about what we're gonna do after this book. If you have any suggestions, or please drop them in the comments. So this chapter looks at the relationship of matter and mind, and it also inquires into the nature of both. And Krishnamurti kicks off this chapter with the question, what is the nature of materialism? Now, in the conversation, as usual, terms are being qualified and a definition of matter must be given based on the line of arguments of previous chapters. So we can start off with a hypothesis, and that is matter is all there is. Now, this might sound disturbing to a couple of people because one would think that A, there's more than matter, and B, what we've discussed so far didn't seem that, that would be a position to take, but there's a reason why we start out with this as our basic assumption, and it'll become clear in the chapter, why we do that. So, to qualify this statement, matter is all there is, there's a series of arguments that is given, and it's probably good to just run through those arguments. So, nature and all human beings react physically. That seems to be an assumption that is rather obvious, Then all matter as we know it goes by the law of action and reaction. That too is a statement that seems rather obvious because it can be observed by pretty much everyone. And this gets interesting because we are now moving into, we are now looking specifically at human beings when we think about action and reaction. And the next statement is, this reaction is sustained by thought. And so it's clear that we're now looking at human beings because we can only talk about human beings as having thought. And thought is a material process, is one of the next statements, and that's at first sight it doesn't seem to make any sense, but it's being clarified. Why is thought a material process? And it's explained in the following way. There is an experience, an incident which is recorded, which becomes knowledge. And from that knowledge, thought arises and action takes place. So they're repeating here the same sort of mechanism that I most likely have been trying to explain in previous videos, and that is that, human beings, since they have brains that are capable of, memorizing thoughts, and not only memorizing thoughts, but memorizing experiences, and experiences, usually having a sort of color or flavor to them, either positive or negative. They tend to then inform future actions of that same individual. So that's what's being described here. And as is expected, we then move into the exploration of how we could, as human beings, begin to move out of that materialistic paradigm that we just described. And we can start with two questions. First, how can one go beyond this material process? And second, is it possible for the mind to go beyond reaction? So, judging from these two questions, we can assume that it would be worthwhile to move out of a purely reactionary or material-based way of living. And we can do so by putting this following hypothesis. If there is to be something new, thought as a material process must end. So the assumption is that as long as we, limit, as long as human beings limit themselves, to this materialistic and hence reactionary mode of existing, we are sort of always, we're like a worm in a can, always swimming in the same sort of soup, and nothing new ever happens. I mean, supposedly there's a fixed number, even though it might seem infinite to the individual, but there's a fixed number of actions and reactions, that one can take in that same sort of can of soup. So if there's to be anything new, then it is assumed that this type of process that we're moving in, this materialist, reactionary and therefore repetitive process must end. So Krishnamurti, I want to quote him real quick. So there is an ending to reaction if one is watchful, attentive, if one understands not only logically, but having an insight into this reacting process. It can, of course, come to an end. That is why it is very important to understand this before we discuss what is an empty mind, and if there is something beyond this, or whether in that very emptying of the mind there is some other quality. So is that empty mind a reaction? A reaction to problems of pain and pleasure and suffering? An attempt to escape from all this into some state of nothingness? Yes, the mind can always do that. Now, understand David Bohm's response in two ways, or at least I would understand it in at least two ways. One is that seeking to go beyond the materialistic paradigm, could be simply regarded as an attempt to escape it, without there being any sort of hope to find anything else. So it could be in itself a pure reactionary movement, But also, what David Bohm's answer could mean is that fundamentally the mind has the capacity to go beyond a materialist-based or reactionary mode of being. And of course, that's the avenue that we're actually exploring, going forward in this chapter. So Krishnamurti then begins to refine the question by saying, is it possible to have a mind that is really completely empty of all the things that thought has put together, so that thought ceases to act? And in this short exchange, we detect the sort of entrapment, that the two postulate that I've described before, that the human mind, the particular mind, seems to be in, And we can attempt to specify this entrapment in the following hypotheses. Reaction is based on a psychological structure. The notion of me as the center of consciousness, and perpetuates itself throughout human history. Only insight into the nature of reaction ends psychological reaction. And thirdly, matter is affected by insight, which is beyond matter. And there we arrive at a similar point as we have in the past chapters. Supposedly the particular mind is able, in principle, to recognize its own entrapment by having insight into the machinations, of thinking and reacting based on thought, and that this very recognition, it is another point, is that this very recognition will itself have a material effect on the brain, as it were, and thus proposing a sort of downward causal relationship of mind with matter. And we should probably throw in a definition at this point, because we're introducing a concept which will be important, I feel, going beyond the discussion of this current book. And that's downward causation. And the definition, Wikipedia's definition is, in philosophy, downward causation is a causal relationship from higher levels of a system to lower level parts of that system. For example, mental events acting to cause physical events. Of course, now at this point you can, say that you can have endless discussions on the nature of a system and on the boundaries of such a system, and therefore on whether there's a causal relationship at all or not. But let's just, assume that there is a causal relationship, a possible downward causal relationship between mind and matter. So in this chapter, we move on to the exploration of the term mind. And it is worth noting how the term mind is used in this text. So another definition is, I guess, called for. The term mind is used here to mean thought, feeling, desire, and will, the whole material process which is going on in the brain and the nerves. And, if you take this definition, it is a rather materialist definition, because it attributes, feeling, emotion, desire, free will, to materialist properties. Just saying, so which is why it's important to see how they use the term mind, how they use it in this text. Now remember how in previous chapters we discussed that there supposedly is a state of mind which is out of time and not centered around this sort of assumed center of consciousness, which is the me or the self. So the question now becomes, what relationship that different state of mind, has to the ordinary state of a particular mind. And one could encapsulate that in the following question: is the state of emptiness within the mind or beyond it? And I read this question to mean if this state is in the particular mind or beyond it. But that's my personal interpretation. Could be wrong. So the answer that is given is clearly, it is the mind itself. So according to them, the other mode of operation, the other possible mode of operation, which isn't centered around an ego or self, is actually a fundamental property of mind, according to this text. Another question to clarify is, does that emptiness not contain a thing, meaning anything that has form, structure, stability? And the answer is no, it doesn't. It is total energy or movement of energy. And we can have a short excerpt to top up this point that was just made. It is not movement of things reacting to each other. The world can be regarded as made up of a number of things which react to each other, and that is one kind of movement. But we are saying it is a different kind of movement, entirely different. There is no thing in it, no thing, and therefore it is not of time. So let's just take that in, let's just put that on the inner backlog, so to speak, and let's sort of end this very point with another hypothesis. Emptiness has no center as the me, and all the reactions. In that emptiness, there is a movement of timeless energy. Now, of course, at this point, we need to revisit our understanding of time and of movement. Because at first sight, to say that timeless energy is moving seems to be contradictory. And let's just consider that this basically comes down to being a discussion about dimensionality, or realms of existence, if you will, if you want to look at it from a term or coin it in terms of human experience, you know. So we have the realm of existence, which is based in 3 spatial and 1 time dimension. And we are asking the question, whether one can go beyond, if there's anything beyond this sort of, we are asking this question from inside that sort of box of space-time, from inside of those 4 dimensions, so to speak. So, and I think I said that before, and maybe this, I'm going to attempt a demonstration, but of course I'll have a piece of fruit, which is handy. So if you sort of consider yourself to be a 2-dimensional being, 2-dimensional, you live on this flat sort of surface of paper. That's all you know. And what I just described is as if you were asking, from the point of view of on that paper, you're somewhere on that paper, that's where you exist. You are asking whether there's anything 3-dimensional outside of the dimensions that you know. And if you take this piece of fruit, for example, which pretty much is a ball, you could imagine that if that ball was to travel through this piece of paper, the piece of paper would be able to detect it, while it's moving through it, and it would detect it as circles on the paper. So, sorry, that is just a number of circles now, but when the ball starts to move through the paper, it starts out as being a small circle. It moves further into the paper, it becomes a bigger circle. At its maximum expansion on the paper, it's the biggest circle, and as it moves out of the dimension of the paper, it becomes smaller again. So that would be the experience of somebody living, on that piece of paper if a ball were to pass through those dimensions. Just to say how seemingly impossible, it is for a person living in 2D to think about three dimensions, and how seemingly impossible it is for human beings who live in 4 dimensions to think of more dimensions than the 4 that they're living in, which is essentially what we're doing in this book. So, back to the question. How are we to understand timeless movement? And I'm going to do the same as I did before. There's a sequence of arguments that will hopefully try to attempt to answer this question. So, timeless movement. It has no beginning and no end. It is not causally determined. We call it movement because it is not still, it is active, it is energy. This energy emerges from emptiness. Emptiness is in the mind. It is a concept of movement, of stillness. The movement is not in time. It is eternally new. And I'm going to give you Krishnamurti and David Bohm's voices to clarify. Creation is eternally new. You see that newness is what the artists are trying to discover. Therefore, they indulge in all kinds of absurdities, but few come to that point where the mind is absolutely silent, and out of that silence there is this movement which is always new. The moment when that movement is expressed. The first expression is in thought. And I think this is an attempt to use the metaphor again, if for us living on this piece of paper, space-time is that piece of paper, it is very hard to imagine that there could be movement outside of space-time, But apparently one is to understand that what they talk about when they talk about movement and emptiness at the same time, or stillness, what they talk about is pretty much I feel, maybe a field of pure potentiality. It's probably easiest to imagine it as such. So, and what is being said here is that when we arrive at a point where we're not preoccupied, anymore with two-dimensional stuff in our heads, we are then able to detect apples or pomegranates moving through, our existence, for lack of a better word, and we're able to detect them. And it'd be probably a good metaphor to think of one of these circles as, a thought, an initial thought, an inspiration, that stems from that movement, which is outside of space-time. So, we said how hard it is to even think of these things when you live in this sort of limited existence box that most of us live in. And so the question is only fair to ask, well, what relationship does all this have with daily life? So what relevance, is there any relevance to this? And to put it in other words, what is the relationship of mind of mind or the absolute to universe, to our universe, to a seemingly material universe? And the answers are, in the universe there is order, and this mind, which is still, is completely in order, as opposed to the mind that is not, as opposed to the particular mind that is not still and therefore in disorder. And another answer, mind and matter are the same. Now, to say that mind and matter are the same might seem confusing at this point. And it might help to qualify the statement a little bit, and say ultimately mind and matter are the same. Because then we can think of matter as being a different sort of phase or state of mind. It's almost that, like, matter is based on the same basic stuff, which supposedly is mind. And I'm going to read you a longer excerpt at this point to clarify. I think it's a worthwhile excerpt. It's rather long, but okay. Let's go back to the body. We have said that the mind, which is of the body, thought, feeling, desire, the general and the particular mind, is part of the material process. Absolutely. And not different from the body. That's right. All the reactions are material processes. And therefore, what we usually call the mind is not different from what we call the body. Quite. Now you're making this much greater in saying, consider the whole universe. And we ask if what we call the mind in the universe is different from what we call the universe itself. That's right. You see why I feel that in our daily life there must be order, but not the order of thought. Well, thought is a limited order. It is relative. That's it. So there must be an order that is free of limitation. Yes, in our daily life, we have to have that, which means no conflict, no contradiction whatsoever. Let's take the order of thought. When it is rational, it is in order. But in contradiction, the order of thought has broken down. It has reached its limits. Thought works until it reaches a contradiction, and that's the limit. So if in my daily life there is complete order, in which there is no disturbance, what is the relationship of that order to the never-ending order? Can that silent movement of order, of that extraordinary something, affect my daily life when I have inward psychological order? Do you understand my question? Yes. We have said, for example, that the volcano is a manifestation of the whole order of the universe. Absolutely. Or a tiger killing a deer. The question then is whether a human being in this ordinary life can be similar. That's it. If not, I don't see what is the point of the order, the universal. Well, it has no point to the human being. You see, some people would say, who cares about the universe? All we care about is our own society and what we're doing. But then that falls down because it's full of contradiction. Obviously, it is only thought which says that. So that universe, which is in total order, does affect my daily life. Yes, I think that scientists might ask how. You see, one might say, I understand that the universe is constituted of matter and that the laws of matter affect our daily life, but it is not so clear how it affects the mind, and if there is this absolute mind which affects the daily life. What is my daily life? Disorderly and a series of reactions, right? Well, it's mostly that. And thought is always struggling to bring order within that. But when it does that, it is still disorder. Because thought is always limited by its own contradictions. Of course, thought is always creating disorder because it is limited. It is itself limited. So, I don't know if you noticed, but there was a small passage. It's one of David Bohm's statements. I'm gonna read it again real quick because I wanna make a remark. So he says, I think that scientists might ask how. You see, one might say, I understand that the universe is constituted of matter and that the laws of matter affect our daily life. But it's not so clear how it affects the mind. And if there is this absolute mind which affects the daily life. So he speaks in that one statement, he speaks to, in how I understand it, to three possible causal, relationships. One of them is the regular, causal relationship that we commonly know is action and reaction within the same sort of dimension. So, human beings, stuff acting and reacting with each other. It's almost like we're a very simple set of billiard balls that just react to each other's movements. But he also asks how, material stuff can affect the mind, which supposedly is outside of this realm, which is supposedly a pomegranate. And he also asks, and which is the third causal relationship, how that can have an effect on this. So it's three possible causal relationships. And since we defined downward causation before, so the effect that this might have on that, we should also look at upward causation, which is what effect does this have on this. So there are two concepts that is worthwhile exploring. I'm just saying that to whoever is interested in these things, and watches these videos. You might want to explore these two concepts because they're quite I think fundamental if you want to think about how to get out of the materialistic paradigm. So let's try to sort of or attempt to summarize what has been said in this rather lengthy dialogue in three hypotheses. So the first one is, even the highest order that we, as particular minds, can produce via thought is limited. Second, in that limitation, there is no freedom, only a limited freedom. And thirdly, Within this limitation, particular minds are prisoners. So, now that we've established the meaning of matter, of mind, and their relationship, and their ways of interacting with themselves and with each other, we can start to think about how a particular mind could reach the state of emptiness and what that would entail. And I'm going to read you a quick quote of Krishnamurti. This means there must be freedom from reaction, freedom from the limitation of thought, freedom from all the movement of time. We know that there must be complete freedom from all that before we can really understand the empty mind and the order of the universe, which is then the order of the mind. And let's finish with two hypotheses that both attempt to capture this whole chapter. The material world is like the body of the absolute mind. There is this universal mind, and the human mind can be of that when there is freedom. I find this first statement fascinating because it, well, it's rather human-centric again, because, but I think it helps us, to think of all the material that there is to be the body of universal mind, the larger universal mind. So, and of course, in consequence, that would not only include human beings, but all the living beings. So I hope this has been of interest to you. If it has, please like, share, subscribe, and I'll see you next time. Bye.